Hello, we're passing the halfway mark in our series, Genesis, the first 3 chapters. And we've reached a point in chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Now, any parent will recognise the words of God below in this text. That combination of liberal generosity and the setting of boundaries, which are part of the daily exchange, really between any parent and child. So here's the text, chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. The Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die." You are free, but. Any observer of Western democracies can appreciate both the glories and the pitfalls of liberalism. When you grant freedoms to people, very often that generosity returns to bite you. And yet the freedom to act, to choose, to speak, to love, or rebel are inherent in being human. You are free, said God, but. Only a very small minority of anarchists will suggest that freedom should have no boundaries at all. But the contentious issue really is deciding where you draw those boundaries, the limits to liberalism, and indeed who imposes those limits. For many years I was a school chaplain at an independent boarding school, and one of my tutees, a sixth former, was called Danny. Now, every Tuesday, the entire school assembled for a gathering which was addressed by the headmaster more often than not. And he chose as his theme on this particular Tuesday to speak of liberalism. He gave a fine erudite talk on the subject, which was both informative and engaging. At the end, the headmaster said to me, as we left the assembly hall, "Will you stop Danny as he comes out? I need to see him." So the school paraded out, and I said to Danny, "The headmaster needs to see you." Danny's response was interesting. So much for liberalism. Danny knew what was coming. He had been caught on some abuse of alcohol at an illicit party, and he should not have been there during the weekend of his boarding school. There are 2 interesting features which come out of the story of Danny. Firstly, many years later, I invited Danny back to speak at a Sunday chapel. Danny had become a Christian. He was now a sports commentator for Sky Sports, and he also helped in his local church in London. And when he came for the weekend, returning some years after this incident, he gave a very fine and biblical talk in the chapel. The second interesting feature of this story is that Danny's father wrote one of the most helpful commentaries on the book of 1 Corinthians. And of course you might remember, Paul in that letter to 1 Corinthians deals with this whole issue of freedom and liberalism and the limits to it. So back to our biblical text. You are free, but liberalism has limits. The first instinct of God is to be generous, to be liberal. There is this vast arboretum for Adam and Eve to enjoy. So much there to enjoy. But there is one tree you may not touch or take the fruit from. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God's liberal generosity was not to be abused. There are lines not to be crossed. One tree was denied to the couple. And it seems that this is part of the human psyche, which often wants to cross boundaries, not accept boundaries that are set. One friend of mine, part of his employment is to paint outside objects, benches and furniture, the rest of it. And he used to find that putting notices on, say, a painted bench saying wet paint do not touch resulted in lots of fingerprints, marks being there because people didn't accept the word. And after a while, he changed his notices to saying, wet paint, touch it and see. And he found that fewer people crossed that boundary and started touching the wet paint. This whole idea of setting boundaries, any parent or grandparent will recognise this is a common feature of that interchange, daily interchange with children. Your bedtime is 9 p.m. and they push it to 9:05. You're only allowed one piece of flapjack, they take a second, and so it goes on. Boundaries are set. It seems part of our nature to want to cross those boundaries. Now, Christians have long argued that we have freedom to love God, to be obedient to him. But that love can only be love if it is freely offered. If I can have the freedom to give love, the opposite must also be possible. Now, I'm not arguing for or against Calvinism here, but the way we respond to God, the God who has initiated that relationship with himself, the way we respond to it in obedience or disobedience is part of our nature. Because God has given us a boundary, he has therefore given us the ability to choose to love and obey. And if that is to be a genuine choice, we must also have the choice to disobey him and be rebellious. And you could say, therefore, God is responsible for evil because he's given us that opportunity. But if we had no opportunity to love and it be genuine love of obedience, if we had no opportunity to disobey, then we would merely be pre-programmed robots. Another example might help clarify this. If I gave a sum of money to a child and I said, would you please go down to the shop and buy me some cooking chocolate because I want to complete this recipe of making chocolate brownies, and they went off to the shop clutching the money I'd given them, but whilst there they decided to buy eating chocolate and to consume the lot rather than use the money I'd given them for the purpose I'd given it, who's responsible for that? You could argue I'm responsible because I gave them the opportunity to obey or disobey. But that is only my responsibility if the person to whom I have given that option is either by age or incapacity incapable of making a clear moral choice. Now, there's no evidence whatsoever that Adam and Eve were incapable of making a clear moral choice, and the choice they made was to disobey God and take from that fruit of the forbidden tree. This brings to mind some of the things St. Paul said in the New Testament. I've already alluded to 1 Corinthians and the way Danny's father had written a helpful commentary on it, and how Paul deals in that book, that New Testament book, with the issue of freedom and the limitations of it. And Paul makes this point in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 23. He says, everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. So there's 2 constraints on our freedom. Firstly, that which is beneficial, and that which is constructive. And then Paul again in Galatians 5:13 and Peter in 1 Peter 2:16 also addresses this theme. Paul says this, you, my brothers, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in the sinful nature, rather serve one another in love. And Peter, live as free men, and do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. So some of the boundaries set by these New Testament writers involve this, thinking through what is beneficial, using my freedom and curtailing my freedom if in any measure it is not beneficial. Thinking through what is constructive. Thinking through what demonstrates love and service to others, and thinking through what it means to serve and obey God. So God is a generous libertarian, but true liberty for all necessarily involves certain boundaries upon each individual. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, said God, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I'd like you to reflect upon this or discuss this with friends. Consider where certain constraints on behaviour and practice might be indicative of a greater love for one's fellow Christians, even if they curtail the freedoms you might enjoy. So think through that and think through some specific examples. Well, thank you for listening to this. We're more than halfway through our series on Genesis, the first 3 chapters, and further talks will follow. Thank you.